This week, I want to draw together several connected themes: urbanization, the growth of slums, precarious labor, gender relations, and globalization. Let's hope that it works. This little video is about urbanization and the growth of slums in the global south. So, what is urbanization? Urbanization means simply the shift of populations from rural to urban areas. So the relative growth of the urban population as compared to the rural one. And the first thing to note is that cities have, of course, existed ever since humans stopped hunting and gathering and settled down for an agricultural life. However, the population living in cities was relatively fixed. The majority of people up until the Industrial Revolution had always lived in the countryside everywhere in the world. And that is simply because most of the economic output was produced there. Agriculture happened in rural areas. Cities were places of trade and of manufacture. Europe was not more urbanized than other areas in the world prior to industrialization. For example, in the 16th and 17th century, Mughal India had a higher urbanization rate than Europe. But this shifts completely with industrialization. And it's very easy to see how the two relate to one another. As production and jobs move from agriculture to industry, so people move or are forced into the city. Urbanization is a process of the proletarianization of peasants. Right. England is completely transformed in the 19th century from a rural to an urban nation as the rate of urbanization shoots up to well over 50%. Countries that industrialized later also urbanized later. Until 1920, the US was essentially a rural and not an urban nation because most of its population lived in the countryside. So, urbanization means modernity, means capitalism, means industry. Let's read some poetry. Here's William Blake's famous folk poem, Jerusalem, written at the start of the 19th century. So, William Blake. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy lamp of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. So this is William Blake recited in a German accent, and this is from the very, very early 19th century, written in 1808. Dark satanic mills, this has become famous, and this was interpreted as the factories of early industrialization. Life, of course, was miserable in the early factory. Endless working hours, child labor, pollution, early death, sickness, a life of work and misery. The life of the early industrial worker was horrible. And hence, it's not a surprise that the city was often imagined as a sort of hellscape, right? And this continues through the present day. There's a new Batman in the movie theaters, and Gotham City is, of course, satanic, a form of hell. The countryside, the green and pleasant land, this is where, according to Blake, Jerusalem lies. This is where salvation lies. Do also read Charles Dickens to get a picture of industrial life in 19th century England. In Germany, it was the Romantics who dreaded cold, soulless modernity and who paved the way for both German hippies and German nationalism. Early sociologists wrote about the intense, nervous nature of city life. The city and modernity were synonymous. Modernity, as we have learned, is something different in the global south. because it was because this European form of modernity was imposed through colonialism and imperialism, and this whole story of catch up politics, of defending against, of appropriating, of making use of the West means that the history of modernization in the global South is a very different one when compared to the global North or the West. This course is about the global South, but as with all the other topics we discuss, the topic of urbanization in the South is better understood when we compare it with urbanization in the North or in rich countries. Right? So let's now move to urbanization in the South and see how it relates to our previous topics of industrialization or the lack of it, of growth, structural adjustment, and all these things. Let's start with a few numbers. In 1750, less than 1 in 5 people in the world was Western. This changes in the 19th century. By 1900, about 1/3 of humanity was Western, so the dominance of the West was reflected in population numbers. In the global South, urbanization and population growth, these go together, really kick off in the 1950s, right? In line sort of with late development or catch-up industrialization. In fact, we are talking about the biggest increase in global population in history from that moment onwards. This is when global population really surges. And the main reason for that is the introduction of modern medicine, which leads to much higher survival chances at birth and throughout early childhood. So there's a population shift in the world, and from a sort of Western majority to a global South majority. By the end of the 1980s, the population of OECD countries, meaning in the rich world, accounts for only about 15% of humanity. Let's switch to urban growth. At the beginning of the 20th century, the vast majority of the world population lived in rural areas. About 85% of the global population, in fact. And according to UN estimates, the turning point came in the early 21st century, 100 years later, around 2007. That year, it's estimated that the majority of the world now lived in urban areas. So the ratio shifted in favor of urban life. And this ratio is projected to increase in favor of the urban population in the near future. Up to 70% of people in the world are expected to live in cities by the year 2050. And most of this urban growth will continue to take place in Asia and in Africa. Asia has 60% of the global population, Africa has 17%, with the highest growth rate. And the two most populous countries in the world are in Asia, which are of course China and India. These are the only two countries that have crossed the 1 billion threshold, and they make up most of Asia's population. Africa is the only other continent to have crossed the 1 billion threshold. According to UN estimates, global population may peak around 10 billion in 2050. This is discounting the potential for World War III and climate change or climate catastrophe. Okay, so why do I talk about population growth so much? Because we need to understand population growth and the lack of jobs, the problem of the economy, when we talk about slums and urbanization. Slums are an integral part of urbanization processes in the global South. What are slums? Slums are to cities what precarious labor is to stable employment. It's makeshift, it's off-grid, survivalist, unofficial, disconnected, unsanitary. When we imagine big agglomerations in the global South, we often imagine massive cities with a city center that is surrounded by a belt of slums. And this isn't far from the truth. Think Manila, think Dhaka, think Delhi, think Rio. Today, according to UN figures, 1 billion people live in slums. That is 1 out of 8 people globally. That is a lot of people. And these are lives spent largely in poverty and largely outside of the formal economy. So, why is that the case? Why does the world have such a large population living in slums? Let's talk about population. Some people think, without always saying it out loud, that there are simply too many people in the world. And this thinking goes back to the early British economist and cleric Thomas Malthus, who argued that economic growth leads to increased consumption and well being, which in turn leads to larger population growth, with the growth in populations being larger than the growth in economic output. And the consequence of that kind of thinking, when is poverty, right? If you have exponential growth of the population but non-exponential growth of economic output, what you get is poverty. And I think this sort of Malthusian thinking pervades implicitly quite a lot of thinking on poverty in the global south. However, that is a form of thinking that ignores two essential aspects of our contemporary world. What are they? First, in theory, this world is technologically advanced and rich enough to feed and house everybody on the planet. That is a fact, right? We have enough resources and enough capacities and means to feed and house everybody that lives on this earth. Economic growth and science have made this dream a possibility. However, the system that we live in seems to preclude the realization of that possibility. Secondly, Malthusian thinking ignores the question of distribution. This is, of course, closely connected. Jeff Bezos could, in theory, wake up tomorrow morning and say to himself, I'm going to end world hunger today. But I guess he will not. So, how do you get slums? Slums exist because of high population growth, a high rate of urbanization, but a low rate of industrialization. When the rate of economic growth and of job creation is lower than that of the population increase, the result is that large groups of people will live outside the formal economy and outside the formal city. Precarious lives lived in slums. To this, add the fact that states in the global south often owe money, or most of the money, to the IMF and the World Bank, money that otherwise could be invested in the poor population. So structural adjustment is one part, by no means the whole, but one part of the story of the growth of slums, which you could also see in the fact that it was in fact in the 80s and 90s that the growth of slums was the highest. People living in informal conditions and doing informal labor live outside of development, live outside of the state. A global surplus population for which capital has too little use.